Good afternoon, and thank you, Ambassador Coe, for helping to make this event possible. You can see how time has overtaken the very thoughtful efforts that went into the Asia Foundation report, because soft power and hard power are outmoded concepts. The new concept is smart power, which I presume means striking the right balance between the use of soft power and hard power, both of which are important. I'm not going to run through the American recommendations in the report in the traditional way. Rather, I'm going to try to briefly talk a little bit about the context for U.S. foreign policy at the present time. I joined the State Department back in the 1950s during the Eisenhower administration. And I went abroad for my first diplomatic assignment under the Eisenhower administration and came back under the Kennedy administration. And it was as though I had left one country and was coming back to a completely different country. In many ways, that's symbolic of what's happening in Washington now. The atmosphere in Washington in the early stages of the Obama administration is fundamentally different from the atmosphere in Washington during the last months of the Bush administration. One, whether he was successful or unsuccessful, and I essentially agree with the way Ambassador Coe outlined some of the achievements of the Bush administration in Asia, but it was an administration that had run out of steam. And the Obama administration has come into office filled with ideas of what they want to do in the world. The problem is it's an inexperienced administration headed by an inexperienced president with a Secretary of State who has not previously held significant foreign policy responsibilities and facing a conjunction of issues that is forcing the administration to start up in crisis mode for the first time in many, many years. It's not simply this economic crisis and the unfinished wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which, if they end badly, have an enormous impact in their own right. But as people have mentioned, there are the unfinished nuclear issues in North Korea and Iran. The United States has the worst relations with Russia since the end of the Cold War. We have an undiminished terrorist threat, although I think that issue is going to occupy a less central position in U.S. foreign policy, and we have looming problems that have to be addressed, such as global warming, environmental issues, energy issues. So, to focus the mind, I like to say that 2009 could be as significant as a turning point in world affairs as the collapse of the Soviet Union was 20 years ago. Why do I say that? Because if you've looked back at the history of the Great Depression and the connection between the failed economic performance of the capitalist societies at that time and the impact that had on thinking about what system for managing economic affairs was better, capitalism or socialism, if you look at the impact it had on the rise of extremist regimes, if you look at the war that resulted at the end of that period, not immediately, it took 10 years for the war to develop. And then you look at the current crisis, which everybody's comparing to the crisis back in the 1930s, you have to keep your mind open to the possibility that we are facing a watershed in human history in which we will either come out of this more positively than leaders were able to do in the 1930s, or we are going to face a world crisis of very significant proportions. Now, we've already seen conclusive evidence that the theories being propagated just a month or two ago about the fact that Asian economies perhaps were delinked from the Western economies so that hopefully their positive economic performance could help pull us out of the problem that had afflicted the American and European economies. In my judgment, the evidence shows that those theories are completely refuted. China's reported 20 million unemployed. Factories in South China are closing in the thousands. Indonesia's exports were down 20% in December. Taiwan has suffered a record 44% drop in exports. Japan is facing negative growth. South Korea is facing negative growth. Singapore is struggling with a severe economic downturn. So the idea that somehow the Asian economies are delinked is simply wrong. We have a globalized economy. This is a global economic crisis of unusual size and scale, and the implications could be enormous. Now let's just look at some of the possible outcomes that could emerge. One is that if and when we get out of this crisis, China is going to be in a relatively stronger position vis-a-vis the United States. This could happen if China recovers more quickly than the United States, and if the economic downturn in the United States is more severe than we hope it will be, speaking as an American. How could this happen? Well, there's some interesting statistics in the morning newspaper for those of you who read it. China, for most of the last decade, has been growing at 10% a year or more in real terms. And one of the papers I read this morning pointed out the statistics show that average household incomes in the United States from 2001 to the present time have been flat. In other words, U.S. growth during that time did not translate into increased income. In fact, it may turn out that the growth figures for the U.S. economy were totally inflated by the inflation of the financial sector, so the United States was not growing significantly in real terms during that period. This involves real changes in balance of economic strength if those types of statistics were to turn out to be that way. What would the implications be? Notice I said relative shift, because the United States has an economy of such a size and has a military establishment of such potential that we're still going to be a big, strong country, even if our relative position is significantly diminished. But it will affect perceptions in two ways. It will affect perceptions of relative power positions in the world, and it can affect discussions about what are the best governance mechanisms for running countries. Liberal capitalism or a more controlled type of market economics, such as we see in China at the present time. But that's not the only possible outcome. Another outcome is that even though the Chinese are heavily focused on the downturn in the Chinese economy, it's conceivable that the economic difficulties in China could get beyond the control of the leaders to find effective countermeasures, in which case domestic instability could emerge as a problem in China. And as many people have observed, government legitimacy in China rests heavily on economic performance now, and therefore there's a potential for systemic collapse in China if economic performance were really to suffer a severe blow. Now, I don't believe that's going to happen. Most specialists that I know don't think that's going to happen. But then again, most specialists didn't think the financial crisis was going to happen. So all I say is the possibility exists of an outcome like that.